The year is 2022, and for years, reverse Vaporize has been the gold standard in the meta for Genshin Impact. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Reverse Melt pretty much just had Ganyu, and some more awkward teams with Kaya, Rosaria, and Chongyun, but they're all kinda clunky, required Xiangling, and often require a lot of resets because cryo characters just don't like it when enemies move. You had Freeze to mitigate that, but bosses can't be frozen, so the teams just don't work in a lot of chambers. Taser was really strong, but it didn't have any of the big PP numbers, so it slept on even today after it got some massive buff. Kazuha was out, but theory crafting for the game was kind of in its infancy, so the dots hadn't really been connected all that well that his 40% damage bonus and 40% res shred from VV more than made up for not getting the 1.5x bonus on reverse melt and vaporize for mono element tech teams. Forward melt and vaporize were kind of unthinkable if you weren't a child main. He was really the only hydro character with massive enough multipliers that could be used for anything but nukes, and the only pyro character until 2025 that could have reliably supported characters like him was Xiangling. If you wanted to do forward melt, you were pretty much stuck with Diluc and had to rely on Rosaria and Kaya. Xiao, Eula, Ito, and Noelle were pretty good if you had a lot of vertical investment into them. Raiden was played by claims that she required her C2, and seemingly every Yai Miko main putting out videos put their house up for mortgage to C6 her and looked at the community like Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake." Vaporize was just better. Xingqiu, Yelan, Kokomi, Ayato, and to a degree Mona could all be used to enable Hu Tao, Yoimiya, Yanfei, and to a degree Diluc to get consistent high damage. And that's not even to mention the massively undervalued part Xiangling played as an actual off-field damage dealer as opposed to a clunky pyro applier. They were also just simpler to build. Hu Tao and Yoimiya were both really strong with the Shimenawa set that everyone was getting while they farmed Emblem for 10 different characters. Yanfei had Wanderer's Troop, which is just thrown at you for playing the game, and they all used weapons that everyone had lying around or were just outright free to get. Compared to the hypercarry teams, they were infinitely more accessible, and the gap between their damage floor and ceiling wasn't nearly as large. That said, Vaporize did have a problem. As I mentioned earlier, the community was only just then being exposed to the world of theory crafting, and those theory crafters were getting the word out on an even better way to play reverse vape, VV vape. Since none of our 4 pyro on-fielders had reliable off-field that could be swirled, in order to swirl pyro, you had to do one of two things. 1, put your Animo character earlier in the rotation and not have VV or that character's buff when your pyro character took the field, or 2, run a second pyro character that you could use after your hydro to clear the aura they applied so the Animo character could swirl at the end of the rotation. This is where the problem arises. You need your pyro on-fielder, a hydro so they can vape, a second pyro to clear the aura, and an Animo to swirl that character's pyro. But Hu Tao, Yoimiya, and yes, even Yanfei, because her C4 shield might as well not exist when you actually build her for damage, all really want to be run with the shielder. Now, you could run Toma or Yanfei as your second pyro to cover that, but they each have their own problems. As mentioned, Yanfei's shield isn't that strong unless it's fully invested into, but to run as a dedicated shielder, she needs an absurd amount of energy recharge and has really low base HP, meaning her shield is always going to be significantly weaker than other shields. Toma is not only kinda clunky to clear the hydro on the enemy with, and still apply a pyro aura for your Animo to swirl, but he also applies his own pyro when your pyro on-fielder is doing their thing, and can make it to where they just don't vape. What was the theory crafted solution? Get good. Except that's not how Genshin works. Let me explain. The solution that was settled on was to just not run a shield, which has kind of always been a way TCs are out of touch with the player base, going all the way back to Zhongli's release. Let me be clear, theoretically, VV Vape was way better than running a shielder, but when you think about the characters that need that shield and why they need that shield, you start to see why Get Good doesn't really apply here. Unless you can find a way to cheese the enemy AI into not attacking you, you're going to have to dodge attacks with those characters. Not only does that cut into the uptime of their abilities, causing a huge damage loss, but there are secondary consequences of having to dodge with them too. With Hu Tao, stamina management is very tight. An extra dodge or two can mean not completing a rotation or not having the stamina needed for a second. With Yoimiya, her normal attacks are perfectly spaced to allow the hits that vape to be the attacks with the highest multipliers. Interrupting her sequence at all can cause you to vape the wrong attacks. So while VV Vape is theoretically better, in practical gameplay it's almost always worse. Because of this, if Lan Yan had been released in 2022, she'd have been a staple in the meta and would likely made theory crafting more approachable because it wouldn't be telling players to play characters in ways they knew would not work. Lan Yan can trigger VV, gives a tiny EM buff with her C4, which considering the community's knowledge of EM at the time would have made a much bigger difference than it realistically should, and provides that shield the characters so desperately need. But not only that, her C2 makes it to where she can be built for damage or EM and still have reliable shielding, which is something we just don't generally see with shielders. However, it's not 2022. It's 2025. And both of those characters have been power crept by characters that don't need a shield and reliably apply enough pyro to be swirled later in the rotation. Arlecchino is tanky as hell as long as you don't have her on White Tassel, has self-sustain, doesn't have tight stamina management, actually wants you to use her skill at the start of a rotation, enabling her to apply enough pyro to swirl later as a solo pyro, and her pyro infusion lasts as long as you want it to. Mavuika has resistance to interruption, reliable off-field pyro, really wants to be run with shielders and healers anyway, and because Claymore attacks are just stronger than polearm attacks, in the one Hu Tao team left where she did anything special, she's better. Lan Yan is 3 years too late. She would have been an asset on any account in 2022, but now the role where she would have shined the most, it's just kind of meaningless now. Except that's not exactly true. Sure, an Animo Shielder for Vaporize isn't something that's needed anymore, but a character came out not too long ago that created a similar problem for Taser that VV Vape created for Reverse Vape: Ororon. You see, the typical Taser team is composed of Sucrose, Xingqiu, Fischl, and Beidou. It works by having Sucrose double swirl Electro and Hydro to repeatedly trigger Electro Charge and reduce Hydro and Electro Res. With Sucrose's EM buff, those swirls and those Electro Charge reactions not only do a lot of damage on their own, but by being Electro reactions triggered by an on-field character, they constantly trigger Fischl's A4, turning her into a machine gun. In addition to the Hydro application from Xingqiu to enable this, he and Beidou both provide a lot of additional off-field damage, but their combined damage reduction makes the team nigh unkillable. Beidou's shield is total trash, but damage reduction also reduces the damage shields take, so the combined over 60% damage reduction ends up making it pretty damn strong. That said, Beidou's damage falls off a cliff in single target and is bottlenecked pretty hard by its reliance on an 80 cost burst. So not only does the team not provide the satisfaction of showing massive numbers, it loses so much damage in single target that it looks a lot worse than it is. However, now that we have Ororon who deals damage when an Electro charged and Night Soul aligned damage is dealt, even without being swapped into, we can replace Beidou with him and kind of run two Fischls. That's great and all, but losing out on Beidou's damage reduction and shield drastically lowers the survivability of the team. It's still technically doable, after all it's what I've been using to deal with the papilla, because Taser is by far the easiest way to get through its invulnerable phase and avoid the one-shot, but it's still really reset heavy because without Beto, it can randomly transform and one-tap whatever character is currently on field without much of a warning. That's where Lan Yan comes in. Like how VV Vape is theoretically better than running a shield, but having a shield makes the team perform better in actual gameplay, Sucrose is still technically the better option on paper. But that shield, even before C2 when it becomes kind of godlike, makes a world of difference in the team's in-game performance. Not only that, but Lan Yan's burst, skill, and first normal attack cause 6 with C6, electro swirls, and electro charge reactions, which front loads a massive amount of damage. You see that chunk of health disappearing? That's not damage from Lan Yan's burst. It's talent level 6 and she's built triple EM after all. It's Fischl and Ororon letting you know how much they love her. The AoE of her normal attacks is also really wide, so she allows the team to go nuts in AoE. Ororon and Beto both increase their damage by a lot with their damage bouncing between enemies, so she's still a good option for the slot even without Ororon, because that AoE means even more A4 procs from Fischl. That said, while her shield should still be enough the majority of the time while built triple EM at C0, C2 makes it to where there's really no downside to building her without attack. Considering the 4-star problem, I think it's pretty cool that Ororon and Lan Yan are as good as they are at C0, and for the most part, fully come online with their earlier constellations. It's a good change of pace to see 4-stars that aren't designed to bait you to pull 4 or 5-star character C2, just the C6 to 4-star. Anyway, that's it. Thought I'd do something a little different than a guide and just have a broader conversation about Lan Yan's role in the game. Lately, I feel like the bigger picture has been lost in character discussions. I normally would prefer just laying out the tools needed for people to broaden their scope, so I don't necessarily like this format. Feels a bit condescending to just say, here's the bigger picture, but I don't really know where to set my expectations anymore. Real, like, what do you do when you've got someone sharing your video in a Discord, telling the people there that you're just some like drama baiter who's talking trash, so they come to the video to invent things to complain about? Just put out a cookie cutter guide where I say the exact same useless information that could be gotten by looking at the in-game guide, or watching another guide, or asking Gemini. Telling people what they already know or want to hear just ain't me. It's not helpful. It just encourages people to not think for themselves. I'll figure something else out that doesn't just dig the hole deeper. Just gotta pay attention to how things go with this one, I guess. Oh, and before I go, I just want to say I still prefer Lynette and Taser over Lan Yan. The combined taunt from Ororon and Lynette kind of solves the issue of needing a defensive utility on its own. You just take less damage because you're being attacked so much less. It is the solution I talked about where you bait the enemy into not attacking you. You can do that with Lynette and Ororon. Anyway, bye.